Hello everybody and welcome to another video of the Simplified opening series. In this video I will tackle a topic that's, well, I've tackled earlier as well. It's about the King's Gambit, as the topic of the video suggests. And if you're a regular on my channel, you have probably noticed that I have spoken about the King's Gambit quite a few times before. And if you have also read my blog, you also know that I have suffered some serious childhood trauma from the King's Gambit. If you haven't, I would recommend you read that blog post on the King's Gambit on my blog. You will easily find it there, so you get some background information on what I'm about to say. You could argue that maybe I'm just going over some sort of therapy here, talking about the King's Gambit so often. But it's an opening that somehow triggers me in a way. And in this video, I would like to show you something that I have been shown some time ago. And basically the video will be, it's comprised of, let's say, two parts, where the first part is insanity and the second part is sanity. And in both of these, let's say, extremes, they involve a move by the knight. Okay, so let's start with the first two moves, and I'll quickly explain what I'm about to show you. E4, E5, F4. So there you go, the King's Gambit. I have to say that I'm not really sure how popular the King's Gambit is at club level, because in my career I have actually faced it only once, even though that game was extremely memorable game for me, because it was one of the most complicated, if not the most complicated game I have played in my career. Not surprising, yeah, the King's Gambit. Even though the queens were exchanged very early on, it was such a mess, and it was a very long game, complicated until the very end, which luckily I won. But I was losing, and it was really nerve-wracking, and well, basically everything I want to avoid when playing against the King's Gambit. But there you go. So the insanity I'm going to show you right now comes from a story I have been told years ago, that sometime in the 90s some elite players, I wasn't told who, were actually discussing the following variation, and quite seriously in fact. And after looking at this line myself, I can now confidently say that back in those days, in the 90s, these players were really spoiled, because they had way too much free time on their hands if they had the time to look at lines like this one. So, well, it's now, I think it's time for me to show you this real shocker of a move that, when I was told, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was some sort of a typo, mistake, or like what the hell were they talking about when they told me about this. But no, actually the move is valid, and well, okay, are you ready? You're not, but I wasn't, but okay, here it goes. Knight h6. There you go. Well, I'm pretty sure you did not expect this, yeah? I mean, when I regained a little bit from my shock, I was like, what the hell? And I was told that, well, actually the move makes sense. It covers the f7 square, you know, which is the most sensitive square for black in the King's Gambit, so kind of makes some sense. Yeah, I guess. But then again, you have the knight on the rim, right? And then those stories. So, kind of, what the hell is going on here? Well, I started to look at this variation, and I mean, really, there are some extremely crazy lines, and I will share some of them here. I won't go too deep into this, because at the end of the day, objectively, the move is not very good. But if white is to actually, in a way, refute it, white must come with some really hard and exact lines. And I can guarantee you that over the board, very few people would be capable of coming up with these moves. So let's take some look at some variations, okay? So we'll start with the not so great moves for white. Let's say d4, not that great. I mean, it attacks the pawn on e5, but after e d4, queen d4, knight c6, it turns out that black has an advantage in development. So the queen escapes, and now d5. And you could see that already after, let's say, d5, knight b4, black really has an advantage in development. The knight is also not that bad on h6. It can come maybe to g4, maybe 8 for bishop g4. And the king on e1 is weakened by this f4 move, sorry, and black has an advantage already. So another not such a great move is the move d3, which after d5 again gives black good play. Another not such a great move is queen h5, which attacks the pawn on e5, but now just knight c6 helps black's development, and black is doing fine again. So these are the not so great moves. Now let's move to some more serious ones, such as bishop c4. It's a natural move that king's gambit here would play. It's the bishop's gambit. But here black also obtains good play with the move c6, intending d5. Now I will just show you the main line of this, like what is supposedly the best way to play for both sides. So knight c3, d5, sacrificing a pawn, e d5, b5. Now the idea is to also go for b4, kick that knight away from c3, so in order to be able to take on d5. So bishop b3, b4, knight a4, now bishop g4, continuing with tempo. Yeah, knight f3, e4. So you see the play is getting very sharp, and it's going to be getting quite messy, but ultimately black is going to be fine. So queen e2, counter pinning, yeah, and attacking the pawn on e4, but now cd5. Now we see the idea of this b4 move, yeah, which was to get the knight away from c3, so now the pawn on d5 is safe. So d3, still undermining the pawn that is attacking the knight, the knight is pinned, and the pawn is also pinned, so we have quite a complicated position in the center. But now knight c6. The idea is to keep attacking that knight with the move knight d4. So d takes e4, knight d4, queen e3, getting away from the pin, attacking the knight on d4, take on b3, e d5 check, and now a very nice move for black, bishop e6. Yeah. So there is no time to take the bishop because the rook is hanging, and then after the rook is taken, there is also the threat of knight c2 check and winning the queen. So take on b3, and now queen takes d5. So black is a pawn down, but has the pair of bishops. The knight is again not that bad because it can come to g4 or f5, and white's king is not that safe. Yeah, even if it castles, there will be some weaknesses on the dark square. So compensation for black here. So kind of a crazy line, hard to find moves. Well, like I said in the beginning, insanity, yeah? But there's more to come, don't worry. Let's move to another King's Gambit style move, knight f3. Looks natural, but again, black is fine after d5. In a way, you get a Falkberg counter gambit with the knight on h6. So e d5, e4, knight e5, and now knight f5. See, here we see the kind of usefulness of that knight on h6 for the first time, maybe. Yeah, the threat is queen h4 check, and there is no g3 because knight g3 happens. Yeah, so white must play g3 to stop queen h4, but now c6, d6, knight c6, and black again sacrificed the pawn, but with very good compensation. Yeah, the bishop can come to c5. Yeah, the king will not find safe shelter, and basically the pawn on e4 is limiting the freedom of white's development. Yeah, not so easy to develop. So now we finally come to the move which actually is the best move for white, and the move that objectively gives white an advantage, and that is the move actually knight c3. I would expect, like, if people think for a very long time in this position and calculate a lot of lines, they may come up with knight c3, but again, I think it's more likely to white to come up with this move if they know it. But I can assure you nobody looks at knight h6 in the King's Gambit. So now, in fact, things are problematic for black. I will show you a couple of interesting lines. One is to take on f4, and the other one is to go d5. So if knight e takes f4, knight f3, the bishop e7. G5 is not so good. Bishop e7 has this move, has the idea of bishop h4 check. It's a common idea in the King's Gambit for black. But after d4, bishop h4, another very hard move for white, because now white needs to find the move g3. Yeah, because if king e2 castles, this is already fine for black. Let's say bishop f4, d5, knight d5, rook e8, and again, black sacrificed material, but the king on e2 is really stuck, and black has excellent compensation here. So this is again good for black, but after g3, the best move, after fg3, hg3, bishop g3, check king e2, this is different. Then the point being that without a pawn on f4, black can't really castle because the bishop h6 would ruin black's king side. And now white is better. Okay, and now white has sacrificed material. White is 2 pawns down, but he's much better because the knight on h6 is really a liability in this position. Now black's only move is d5, but things are not so great. So let me show you the other line, d5 now. And here again, white needs to find a lot of only moves, not only to have an advantage, but also not to be worse. So knight d5 is the first move that is of such nature. And now black has 2 moves, bishop c5 and knight g4. After bishop c5, white must find d4. Again, not an easy move. And after e4, b4, another only move, not to be worse. And after bishop d6, queen d4, f6, knight f3, c6, knight c3, white is better. Yeah, pawn up, and it's not quite clear where black's compensation is, even though the position remains messy. There is an even messier line after knight g4. And again, trying to take advantage of that knight being on h6. Now, if knight f3, c6 is okay for black, because when the knight moves, e4 can happen. So white must take on e5. Now c6, knight f4, bishop c5. Yeah, targeting the knight, but also bishop f2 or knight f2. Yeah, so only move knight g h3, defending the f2 square. And now a very curious tactic, knight h2. Yeah, and the point of the tactic is that the knight cannot be taken after rook h2. There is check on h4, g3, queen g3, rook f2, bishop f2, knight f2, queen f4, and black is better, being an exchange up. Yeah. So white needs to find the only move, d4. Yeah. And after knight f1, again, everything is great for black, even having some advantage, except for one move, which unfortunately not only is the only move for white, but also gives him a almost winning advantage. But that move is, again, not so easy to find, and it's the move knight h5, targeting g7. So you could see quite crazy lines after this move knight h6. I think it's a good try for a surprise weapon, even though it's not objectively the very good move. But there you go, my shocking story from some years ago when I was told about this move, and well, I kind of found the time to quickly check the move and get to the bottom of the line. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work for black, but as you could see, it offers quite a lot of wild opportunities for both sides. And if white, again, he has a lot of moments where he could go well, wrong and well, basically lose. So now that's the insanity part of the video that I promised from the start. Now I'll show you more sane approach, and the one that I think again is kind of a good one, because it leads by force to an endgame. And I think if you get a King's Gambit player to an endgame, it's already some sort of a moral victory. I mean, on my channel, I've already proposed several good lines against the King's Gambit. I recommend you check these videos, because not well, all lines are to everybody's taste, so you can just choose what you prefer. But this is another line which I think is pretty good and very, very simple and easy, as it's a forced one leading directly to an endgame, and one that is basically doesn't require any memorization. And again, it's another knight move. It's actually the same knight move, but more sensibly towards the center with the move knight f6. Yeah, so knight f6 attacking the pawn on e4. And from this moment, unless white wants to go for the Vienna knight c3 d5, which is great for black, white must take on e5, and now game is really forced. So knight takes e4. The threat is queen h4 check. Yeah, so knight f3. And now the move that needs to be remembered, knight g5. It's a kind of a peculiar move, but it's a very concrete one, and creates the threat of taking on f3 and then giving the check on h4, which is not so easy to parry. Yeah. So white goes d4, establishing the center. Knight takes f3, queen h4 check. So it's a check, but also an attack on the pawn on d4. So queen f2, better than queen g3 because that would double the pawn. So queen f2, king f2, and there we have it, an endgame. So move 8, already we have an endgame, and which objectively is equal. As I said, I think it's already I think it's a moral victory for black if they get to an endgame against the king's gambit player. So in this position, the move d6 is best, undermining white's center and forcing basically the exchange of these pawns. This is slightly more precise than the move knight c6, which was knight c6, c3 d6, which was played in a famous game, the game Fischer-Wade, played in Vinkovci in 1968, a game that Fischer won, but he should not have won it because the game was, the position was drawn. But okay, he eventually won. But this game also kind of shows that black, the choice of the variation was quite to the point, and black managed to equalize against the great Bobby Fischer. But d6 is somewhat better. E d6, bishop d6, and now already the first moment where white must be ultra precise. So what follows again is obviously a computer analysis, but you will see that based on the complexity of the variations and the difficulty of the variations, it will show you that white must be ultra precise, super precise, if he is to keep at least some initiative. Even this won't suffice. Yeah, black will parry all these attempts, but you will just see that white must be either fantastically prepared and know all these exact moves that follow, if they are to exert even some sort of pressure on black's position. So this is the first moment, and perhaps some sort of a comfort is that in this position, when Jan Nepomniachtchi, who famously published a course on the King's Gambit on Chessable, he messed up here as well. So when he was faced with this position in the game against Mamedjarov in 2022, he probably didn't expect it, and he vaguely remembered that one of white's ideas to go knight d2 and then he have the options of knight e4 and knight c4, but he played it immediately, which was wrong, as knight d2. Now the short castle by Mamedjarov was also fine, but bishop f5 is actually strong, hitting that pawn on c2, and after c3, c6, knight c4, and the bishop can conveniently drop back to c7. Black has absolutely no problems. And the point of all this is that the bishop on f5 stops the development of the white bishop to d3. Yeah, so this is the first point. So with this in mind, bishop d3 is white's best move. So stopping bishop f5. Yeah. So now short castle. I've looked at other moves like bishop e6, knight c6, for example. I think I can show you knight c6 a little bit because it involves this idea of long castle for black if allowed. And again, white must be ultra precise, and in fact he must sacrifice a pawn in order to keep some initiative, but even there black is fine. So for example, c3 here is already completely harmless. It defends the pawn, but bishop e6 followed by long castle is perfectly fine for black. Just no problems whatsoever. So white should give the check rook e1, bishop e7. And now again, c3 is harmless because bishop e6 followed by long castle is perfectly fine for black. So white should actually play knight c3, sacrificing the pawn on d4. Knight takes d4, knight d5, attacking the bishop and the pawn on c7. So the only move to cover that is knight e6, defending the pawn on c7 and blocking the e-file. And now knight e7, king e7, and b3. So white is a clear pawn down. It's not kind of obvious that white will regain the pawn anytime soon, but he does have the pair of bishops, and black's king is somewhat stuck in the center. But black is fine here. Okay, bishop d7, bishop a3, king d8, rook a8, a d1 and king c8. So yes, white has an obvious initiative and a pair of bishops, but nothing concrete. Yeah? Whereas if black given time to kind of untangle, exchange some pieces, get the rooks in the center, well then the extra pawn can tell. So this is just one possible line that black can try. Again, note that white really must play very precisely, very exact moves in order to keep the game somehow going. Otherwise, black has no problems whatsoever immediately. So let's go back, but check the plans with short castle. And now knight d2. This is the correct development for white. The knight is aiming either for e4 or for c4. And now rook d8. Bishop e6 is possible. I also checked, let's say, bishop f4, going for exchanges. Let's say g3, bishop h6, rook e1, knight d7, knight f3, take on c1, rook c1. So more exchanges. The position simplifies. Black is fine. Maybe white is slightly a bit better, but I mean, the bottom line in all these slightly better for white positions and so on is that they require, again, this extremely high level of precision in order to make something out of that minuscule advantage. And both you, my viewers, and myself, I don't expect to play the players who would play with this very high level of precision. We are not going to play Carlsen or somebody of that sort. So I think we shouldn't really worry about entering slightly worse positions, which are safe, which are okay, some probably comfortable, in the fear that we are slightly worse or that the engine shows us that we are slightly worse. No, I think that slightly worse, in order to make something of that slightly worse for the opponent, is requires that level that we are not going to face the players of that level. So we should be confident that we probably won't suffer and we can make at least a draw, if not even turn things around. So it's all about the level of opposition that we are facing. Rook d8 is the best move, I think, because it targets this pawn on d4 very quickly. So knight e4, attacking the bishop, and now bishop e7. Yeah, it's also possible to go to f8. The bishop on e7 is controlling the g5 square. So, I mean, bishop f8 is also possible. Knight g5, g6. And now some flurry of tactics. Bishop c4, attacking f7. But now bravely h6. Yeah, attack the knight. Knight f7 and rook d4, attacking the bishop. Yeah, bishop b3, and now again calmly knight c6. And the discovered check threatens very little. Yeah, if knight h6, the king can just move and the knight is somewhat trapped. It has to go back to f7, but it's no real way out after knight f5, attacking the bishop that defends the knight, so it's kind of tricky for white. But let's say bishop e7, a bit safer, rook e1, and now h6, stopping knight g5. King f8 is also possible, and after knight g5, h6, it will likely transpose. I will show you this line. It's a very interesting line. But by playing h6, black simply wants to go bishop e6 and not worry about knight g5. And at the same time, don't forget that the pawn on d4 is hanging. But again, if white wants to make something here out of the position, the only way to do so is by sacrificing that pawn and going bishop f4. Because again, c3, bishop e6, that's it. No problems for black whatsoever. Yeah. So bishop f4. And now two moves, or I mean even three. c6 is probably the easiest one to play. But I want to show you some interesting lines again, starting with rook d4. Just taking the pawn. Now knight f6 should be played by white, not bishop f6, rook e8. That would be embarrassing. But king f8. Yeah. Knight h7 check, king e8, bishop e5. Yeah, and now rook takes d3. Yeah, very, very interesting line, very forced. C takes d3 and bishop f5. Turns out that the knight has no way out. But the line continues. Bishop takes g7, bishop takes h7, bishop f6, knight c6. It seems that white is losing because just two pieces for the rook, but white is just in time to save the game. Take on e7 with the rook, knight e7 and rook e1. So thanks to the pin, white gets back the material. But the point is that after king d7, rook e7 check, king d6, rook f7, bishop d3, it's basically dead drawn. endgame with bishops of opposite color. So kind of a exciting line even in the endgame, but ending with the equal position at the end. So let's go back to the move. Okay, rook e1 h6, sorry, bishop f4, and this was rook d4, but there is also knight c6. And this is probably a bit more ambitious for black, threatening not only to take the pawn on d4, but also controlling d5 square, and you will see that this is actually important. Now bishop c7, rook d4, there are no tactics as earlier, so this is fine for black. So c3 now. Yeah, but you will see that this knight on c6 and this control of the e5 square is important because the bishop on d3 is no longer defended. So g5. And now you see the point. If the bishop draws back to d2, knight e5 is kind of annoying, yeah? Attacking the bishop, and the knight is basically taboo because the bishop on d3 is hanging. Bishop g3 is just bad because after f5, f4, white loses a piece. So white also needs to be careful here. The only move, like sensible move, is take on c7, rook d7, and now no choice, has to go back to g3, and after f5 it appears that white is losing material, but somehow white manages to stay in the game. Again, forcing line, bishop c4 check, king g7, and d5 now. Knight e5, again everything is hanging. The bishop on c4, the knight on e4, and f4 is also a threat, so, but white manages to stay in the game with the move d6. Yeah. Giving the check leads to a worse endgame for white. King f8, knight d2, knight c4, and check on c5 and take the pawn on d5. Pair of bishops and kingside majority. Black has an advantage here. Yeah. So nice way to overtake the initiative. But after d6, actually the game surprisingly leads to a perpetual check, even though it doesn't look like it just now. So bishop f8, still keeping all the attacks. The bishop on c4, the knight on e4, and f4 trapping the bishop. So bishop e5 check, king g6. Still two pieces are hanging. So the only way for white to survive is to force the perpetual with bishop d5, f takes d4, bishop e4, king f7, bishop d5, and king g6. Phew! This was quite of a ride, yeah? Even though I said this knight f6 line is more sane, you could see that if white really is prepared, like, well, very well, to say the least, it can also lead to some exciting lines, even though I expect in practice none of this to happen, and white to play some sensible moves when black would obtain equally sensible endgame, and basically an equal endgame. Yeah, and then just then take it from there. So I hope you enjoy this venture, one more venture in the King's Gambit territory. Thank you for helping me in my therapy heal my childhood trauma with this opening. Hope you enjoyed the lines. Maybe you use some of them depending on your mood for sanity or insanity. Well, that's up to you. So I will conclude this video. Please subscribe to my Substack if you want, and if you really like my work, you can become a paid subscriber to my Substack and support my work both there and here on my YouTube channel. And speaking of my YouTube channel, make sure you smash that subscribe button and leave your comments in the comment section what you think about the insanity in the King's Gambit. So thanks for watching, and I will see you soon in another video on my channel. Take care and all the best. Cheers.